Hi, and welcome back for our 45th class on the Christian Basics, or for my Lutheran teenagers out there, Confirmation. Every week, we aim to bring you biblical content that will help you in your new or emerging walk with Christ. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor down at First Lutheran in Houston, and this week we're looking at a first of a two-part series on St. Paul and his letters. Let's roll. Well, St. Paul, as we talked about in the last video, is especially called Apostle of Jesus Christ, and as he went around, he formed churches, and then he would write letters to those churches, and about half of the New Testament is made up of these letters of St. Paul. We could spend a lot of time looking at any one of these letters. In fact, there are pastors who have preached on the gospel, on the book of Romans for like 5 years, going through it verse by verse. We're going to be looking at 5 of Paul's letters in just a few minutes today. So really, it's just an introduction. Of course, I highly encourage you to read all of these letters on a regular basis, but we're just going to be taking a big picture look today. Well, I already mentioned Romans, so let's start with Romans. Romans is really a theological masterpiece. It's written to a congregation that St. Paul has never even met. And in this letter, he really lays out what we call the doctrine of justification, or the question of how we are made right in the eyes of a holy God, even though we are sinners. It's where we get some of the more famous phrases about being justified by grace through faith, apart from works of the law, for example. Now, Romans 1 is really geared towards Gentiles, that is, non-Hebrews, people who are not under the specific law of God. And he basically says that they have given up on the God that they know exists and personified that, lived that out through their pagan idolatry, their worship of false gods. This is what Paul writes in Romans 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Now in Romans 2, it is specifically addressed to Jews, and Paul is saying, hey, just because you're Jewish and you have this lineage to Abraham, that doesn't mean that you're saved. In fact, in Romans 3, it is said that we are all sinners, we all fall short of the glory of God, and if and when we are saved, it is only by the grace of God. Here's kind of the money quote from the summary of these first 3 chapters in Romans 3. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. That is the gospel. That is what the reformers in the 1500s worked so hard to reclaim, the idea that you're saved, you're made holy by God himself through grace, not because you are obedient or are able to fulfill perfectly the law of God. In fact, this is the message of the entire Bible. Paul looks at Abraham in Genesis, and he says, even Abraham is reckoned as righteous by his faith in God, his trust in what God will do for him and in the future. Now, as soon as Paul preaches this gospel, he is accused of peddling a cheap gospel or a false gospel that basically, now that you're saved by grace alone, you can just live however you want. This is the same thing that Martin Luther was accused of when he rediscovered the gospel, when he brought people out of the bondage that the church was actually holding them in. And so there's a lot of overlap here with Paul's life and Luther's life in the sense that they were both accused of wanting to bring people out of obedience to the law of God through this message of grace. And there is such a thing as cheap grace that does teach that the overwhelming grace of God can excuse certain sins. But that is not what Paul is saying here, and it is most definitely not what Luther said either. Here's what Paul said when he is met with this accusation that if you sin more, then you have more grace, so maybe it'd be a good thing to sin more. He says, is that the case? The answer is in Romans 6. He says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? So yes, we are to be obedient, certainly to the law of God. But moving ahead in Romans, Paul declares that God is powerful, to save, that he calls and elects his people to salvation for his purposes. Romans 8 is one of the more famous passages in the whole book, so we'll read it here. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Well, so much more could be said, of course, but the point is that God's salvation is truly by grace. You can't choose it, you can't earn it, you can't work for it. If you could, then it wouldn't be grace. It wouldn't be a gift. It would be your wages, which every workman is due. But that's not what it is. It is a gift of God. Let's look quickly at 1st and 2nd Corinthians, two letters that Paul wrote to the people in Corinth, a town where he did ministry. And you'll notice right away, if you read these side by side, they're very different from Romans, whereas Romans is a kind of well thought out, beautifully crafted, expertly crafted, really, letter. 1st and 2nd Corinthians are what are called occasional letters. That is to say, he is writing to respond to specific events going on in the life of the church there. Now, Corinth was known as a rough and tumble city, very pagan, lots of pagan idolatry and worship going on. And so the Christians that he does manage to convert, they're still struggling with this pagan environment. And maybe the thing he struggles with the most, which you read over and over in these letters, is that Paul is always justifying himself and justifying his authority. Other people, this might happen in your own life too, right? Other people came in after Paul and said, hey, wait a minute, Paul's not really preaching the true gospel. Paul's not really an apostle. I am. And so Paul has to say, no, I'm the real apostle. I'm telling you the truth. I have these words directly from Jesus Christ. And so some of the main issues that Paul has to deal with are things like just rank immorality among the believers. They're still living in pagan ways, and he realizes that has to be put to an end. There is this problem of meat sacrificed to idols, which sounds kind of strange to us, but back in the day, they'd kill an animal, sacrifice it to an idol, and then that meat was sort of dedicated to a false god. And people are wondering, can Christians eat that? Paul has a great answer. It's like, well, you can, but you shouldn't if it is difficulty for your pagan friend or a new Christian who's still struggling with these sorts of things. He deals with divorce. He deals with sexuality. And in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, we have the longest explanation of the spiritual gifts, things like tongues and faith healing and prophecy, and how they're to be used, or if they're to be used in the church. And in the midst of that conversation, you have one of the more famous passages from 1st or 2nd Corinthians, and it's the love passage. You find it heard at a lot of weddings, for example. I'll read it. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The point is that all Christians, not just married couples, are to love one another in this way. That is how we get past our conflicts in our life together. But right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians is an equally beautiful and really philosophically rich passage about the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of God. Let me read that for you. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Well, if you are ever tempted by the wisdom of the world, remember this verse and think otherwise. Well, Galatians is probably Paul's angriest letter. He is really hot when he's writing this letter. He skips a lot of the normal formalities and niceties, and it deals with what is called the first controversy in the church, the Judaizer controversy. Basically, again, people came in after Paul left and said, well, we agree with everything that Paul said about Jesus, that he's the Son of God, that you need to worship him and believe that he's the Christ and that he died for your sins, but you need to be circumcised if you're a male because you need to fall under the Jewish covenant before you can be saved by the Jewish Messiah. And Paul said that was such a compromise of the gospel that he preached, that if anyone preached that, even an angel from heaven, if they came down and preached a different gospel than he preached, then they were anathema. They were cursed. Do not believe that. I have come with the true gospel that totally frees you from these kinds of ceremonial bondages towards the law. It's done. That is what the cross of Christ accomplished. So the ceremonial law will no longer save you. The ceremonial law, in fact, was meant to point to the sacrifice of Christ. And now that that sacrifice has been made, trust in that sacrifice, and that is sufficient for your salvation. This is what he writes right at the beginning of Galatians. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. Now later in Galatians, we get the very famous list of the fruits of the Spirit, and that may be something you've heard about in the past in Sunday school. Certainly it's something we should be aware of. Just like the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians, the fruits of the Spirit are also part of the Spirit's work among us. I'll read this from Galatians chapter 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such, there is no law. Finally, let's take a very quick look at 1 Thessalonians, written to the saints at Thessalonica. That's why it's called Thessalonians. Thessalonians is really Paul at maybe his sweetest and his most loving and gentle towards other Christians who are under his care. The main issue here is when Jesus is going to come again. The people in Thessalonica were concerned that, or they believed that Jesus was going to be coming back to judge the living and the dead very quickly, and they wonder why he hasn't come yet, because people in the congregation are dying, and they're wondering, well, what about those people? What happens to them if they die and Jesus has not come back? This is what Paul writes. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. So Paul's encouragement is that because we don't know when Jesus is going to come again, to stay sober, that is, to be watchful, to continue to work hard. Don't shirk your responsibilities. Don't think it's time to be lazy because Jesus could come at any minute. That is not loving towards your neighbor. Jesus will come, as he said, like a thief in the night. So in the meantime, we continue to work and do what is right. Surely that is good advice for us as well. Well, thanks for watching. Next week, we're going to look at another grouping of Paul's letters, brilliance and loveliness to be found in them all. Remember to subscribe to this channel. It's a great help to me. It helps other people find this. Again, this is a video series produced for those who really don't know anything about Christianity, so would like to get the word out. Email me anytime, christianbasicsclass@gmail.com. Check out FL Houston for all the worksheets for the videos so that you can teach this as a confirmation class or just give yourself an exam. And if you don't know the answers, email me and I'll let you know what they are. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. Take care.